I want to respond to a misconception that one could easily get from listening to this Panpsychism series. I don't want to undercut materialism. I don't want to throw out materialism. I want to build on materialism, explain some of the things it can't explain. I want to make more progress in the same general direction that materialism set out in when it became the dominant paradigm, namely monism, physicalism, and naturalism. I'm not anti-materialism any more than neo-Darwinists were anti-Darwinism. And I've handled the subject of panpsychism mainly as a dispute among fellow materialists and physicalists. Throughout, I've assumed that most of you are materialists, and that very few of you are dualists, and essentially none of you are idealists. I haven't spoken at any length about subjective idealism, the view that mind is fundamental, or all there is, while matter is a sort of illusion. Idealism has a respectable tradition, but it's very hard to imagine being an idealist any time after the early 20th century. The view suffers from unique problems. For one, it implies anti-realism about the external world. The external world doesn't exist if no one's having an experience of it, and this makes it very difficult to explain why matter and our experiences are so lawful and seem to obey strict regularities. If our experiences are not caused by an external world, they should be random or up to us, but this doesn't seem to be the case. Many idealists think that matter simply doesn't exist, and many believe matter to be a sort of illusion dependent on mind, perhaps the mirror image of Keith Frankish and Dan Dennett's illusionism. We can clarify the distinctions between idealism, materialism, and panpsychism by asking what would happen to consciousness if we eliminated all matter from existence and vice versa. Idealists believe that if you eliminated all matter, mind would still exist. Matter is dependent on mind. Materialists believe that if you eliminated all matter, mind would no longer exist. But you could eliminate all mind, and matter would still exist. Panpsychists, however, think that there is only matter, and that there are two sides to it, the internal and external. There are two ways of talking about it. Matter looks like one thing from the outside, and looks like another from the inside. Mind isn't caused by matter, or vice versa. Rather, they're synonymous with each other. They're the same thing, but one characterizes the internal, and the other the external. One is the view from the inside, so to speak, and the other is the view from the outside. Physicist Sean Carroll claimed that one prediction on a model like this would be for matter to diverge from the laws of physics on occasion. I think this is a product of anthropomorphizing conscious experience, conflating human consciousness with all of consciousness. What it is likeness doesn't preclude law-like regularities. In fact, many panpsychists imagine that it may be the source of the law-like regularities we observe. Joseph Priestley pointed out that it's never been established that sensation and thought are incompatible with attraction, repulsion, or the behavior of matter in general. Again, there's only one stuff, with a division between internal and external. There's the behavior of matter, how it looks and what it's doing, spin, mass, charge, etc. And then there's the internal, intrinsic nature of matter. David Hume pointed out that we only perceive conjunction, one event following another, but we do not directly perceive the actual inner workings of causation, the driving power, whatever is generating empirical data that we take in through the senses. We don't directly perceive the source of causation. We directly perceive regularities, conjunction, and so on. Panpsychism could have a lot to contribute regarding the mysteries of causation, as well as the intrinsic nature of matter. In his conversation with Philip Goff, I heard Sean Carroll say that he doesn't think that matter has intrinsic properties in addition to its structural, behavioral properties. Once you've described everything that matter is doing, you're done. You've explained everything that matter is. All you have to do is describe the structure, behavior, and that's all there is. There are no intrinsic properties in addition to behavioral properties. But he also says that he doesn't deny the reality of consciousness. And I happen to know from reading his book The Big Picture multiple times that he strongly opposes radical emergence, or strong emergence. If you're inclined to agree with Carroll that there is nothing in addition to structure and behavior, then you have to give up the reality of consciousness. The thing is, Carroll has to know he's wrong from his own case. I will never be able to see his consciousness. I'll only ever be able to see neurons firing, electrochemical activity in the brain. I have no access to his consciousness. To make this point vivid, think of the problem of other minds. Not just if my red is your red, but how you even know anyone else is conscious besides yourself. I know that I'm conscious. It's the thing that I'm most certain of, and I'm reasonably sure that you're conscious, but I can never be as certain that you're conscious as I can be that I'm conscious. So hopefully you'll agree with me that the degree to which I'm certain that I'm conscious and the degree to which I'm certain that you're conscious will never be equal. I will always be more certain that I'm conscious than I am that you're conscious. That's because I have no access to your consciousness. No matter what crazy technology comes about, that will always be true. Now think about what that means. If you agree with me that consciousness is real, that means there's something that's real that can't be observed from the outside. It's part of the natural world, I would say it's part of the physical world, but you can't observe it from a third-person perspective, and yet it's nonetheless real. That's a very interesting fact about our universe. It's a very interesting fact about matter, and I don't think it's been adequately dealt with. I don't think the implications of that fact have been adequately dealt with. So back to Carroll's point about structure and behavior. He says that once you've described what matter is doing, you've explained what the matter is, in full. There's nothing else. But if you accept the reality of consciousness, you know that that's not true. Because all I can see of your brain and the matter that is you, all I can see is electrochemical activity. The what it is likeness is unobservable from the outside. You have to be that chunk of matter to observe it. And yet it's nonetheless real. And if you're a physicalist and a monist and a naturalist, I would say this has radical implications for the nature of matter. We know there's more to matter than just structure and behavior, from our own case. But why think experience goes all the way down? Well, for me, it's because I don't accept strong emergence. If you're telling me that you can arrange matter for which it's not like anything to be, in increasingly complex configurations, and then suddenly it's like something to be, that would seem like strong emergence to me. There is something new that was not there before and can't be reduced to its component parts.
And the idea here is that something like nature does not produce giant leaps where something absolutely novel appears out of nothing. It's a very big question whether or not strong emergence is a coherent notion or a possible notion. And it is opposed to the picture that the world is a purely physical process. The purely physical processes don't really allow for the emergence of these novel features, not absolutely novel. If you think about the way the physical
So if you
world
accept
operates,
material composition, you're a materialist monist, and you accept the reality of consciousness, the fact that it's like something to be, and you don't believe in strong emergence, well, put those together. These views have radical implications for the nature of matter. So we know from our own case that there's more to matter than structure and behavior, and once you've described what the matter is doing, you haven't described everything there is to know about the matter. So Carroll is just wrong about that. If he wants to say that behavior is all there is, then he has to somehow reconcile that with the reality of qualitative experience. The only thing you really need to give me to acknowledge this point is that the degree to which you're certain that you are conscious will never be the same as the degree to which you're certain that I'm conscious. Why is that? Well, it's because there's more to matter than its behavior and structure. From the outside, all I can see are neurons firing and wet, gray tissue. But you know that there's an internal, subjective side to that matter. From the inside, there is conscious experience. As Russell and Eddington pointed out, the best clue we have regarding the intrinsic nature of matter is from our own case. If you think you're solely composed of matter, we already know that at least some of the time, physical goings-on are synonymous with experience. So the hard part, as it were, is already over. So I've taken it as an assumption that materialism was the only game in town and attempted to refine materialism and physicalism into a more tenable and satisfying position. There have been many notable panpsychists in intellectual history. Schopenhauer was a panpsychist, so was Alfred North Whitehead and Ernst Haeckel, an early proponent of Darwinism. We can also claim Spinoza, William James, and Teilhard de Chardin. Today we have Galen Strawson, Philip Goff, Hedda Hasselmerk, Annika Harris, and many others, as well as the neuroscientists Giulio Tononi and Christoph Koch. The renewed interest in panpsychism has been brought on by the rediscovery of arguments made by Bertrand Russell and Sir Arthur Eddington in the 1920s, and contemporary philosophers have built on their insights. Russell and Eddington realized that physics tells us what matter does, how it behaves. It doesn't tell us about the intrinsic nature of matter, insofar as there is more to matter than its structure. Physics doesn't give us any reason to suppose fundamental reality is wholly non-experiential. This is what Galen Strawson calls the silence of physics. So physics is silent on what or if it's like something for a bit of matter like myself. But what reason do we have to suppose that there is more than structure and behavior when it comes to matter? Why would I think that matter would have additional non-structural properties? Well, I've already touched on this, but let's start with what we know. We know that we're conscious. Consciousness is not a structural property or a behavior that can be observed from a third-person point of view. And if consciousness is the one thing that can't be an illusion, and we believe we're composed of matter, nothing more and nothing less, it follows that we know that at least some of the time, matter has properties in addition to behavioral properties, maybe even all of the time. And come to think of it, what is the evidence that there is any matter for which it's not like anything to be? We know that physical goings-on are synonymous with conscious goings-on, at least some of the time. In fact, we have zero insight regarding the intrinsic nature of physical goings-on, except in our own case. That is our starting point. So the burden is entirely on the one who wants to say that there is such a thing as non-conscious matter. To quote Hedda Hasselmerk, what is the evidence that particles are not conscious? That we have not observed them to be so is arguably irrelevant, because consciousness can't be observed except in our own individual case. End quote. I argued in the first objections episode that the primary reason we find panpsychism counterintuitive, besides anthropomorphizing conscious experience, is because of our theory of mind, our evolved psychological module that detects and interprets the conscious states of others. That module is the reason we think there's such a thing as non-conscious matter, not because of some well-supported argument. So we don't even know there is such a thing as matter that is not experience involving, and the evidence for its existence is zero. And we know consciousness is real, so if we have a bias against strong emergence, then why wouldn't we suppose it goes all the way down? That consciousness is fundamental and ubiquitous is the more responsible view that takes on fewer unjustified assumptions. As I mentioned in the Four Premises episode, you're either going to end up a dualist, denying the reality of consciousness, or positing some kind of strong emergence to make it work as a non-panpsychist. Unless you're a part of an even stranger group than panpsychists, you'll agree when I say that you know that you're conscious. So everyone has to answer the following question. How far down does consciousness go? Most people, except for a few philosophers, are in agreement that humans are conscious. Most people will also say that chimpanzees are conscious. Dogs, sure. If I say fish, I'll lose some people. I'm not sure what fish are doing with their brain and nervous system, or what they're doing with their eyes, if not seeing things with them. That's kind of what eyes are for. But even if you agree that fish are conscious, what about flies? Are worms or fleas conscious? What about trilobites, or single-celled organisms? Where did consciousness first emerge? Remember, it's a binary thing. It's either like something, or it's not. It can't kind of be like something, or seem to be like something. This is not a how many hairs until it's a beard situation, or how many grains of sand until it's a pile. Consciousness doesn't exist on a spectrum, at least not consciousness in the Hegelian sense. So at some point in evolutionary history, this binary switch was flipped for some reason. Suddenly, it's like something for that collection of molecules, but not for the one it came from. The preceding system was nearly identical to the new conscious system, but it nevertheless made this enormous leap from being entirely non-conscious to being conscious. Like I said, everyone has to answer this question of when the lights came on in the chain of emergence and in evolutionary history. Due to the well-established correlation between brain and consciousness, most reasonably suppose that the brain and nervous system are the relevant parts. You need a brain for consciousness. That's obviously how we have our particular brand of conscious experience, but it doesn't follow that it's the only way consciousness can emerge. That would mean that arranging subatomic particles into nerve cells would suddenly generate consciousness. The lights are completely off when those same particles are arranged in a slightly different way, but arrange them as a nerve cell, and now it's like something for that matter to be. So will one nerve cell do it? What about two nerve cells? Will that do it? What's so special about nerve cells anyway? They're not made of unique material. It's the same protons, neutrons, and electrons as always. So it must be in the arrangement, right? I obviously agree that altering the configuration of matter will alter conscious experience, but I don't agree that altering the configuration of matter will transition non-experiential stuff to experiential stuff. That would seem, and in fact be, a case of strong emergence. That is, if you accept that you're made of matter and nothing else, and that consciousness is real, which hopefully you do. Despite the pan in panpsychism, most subscribers don't believe that everything is conscious. Abstract entities, like numbers, wouldn't be considered conscious. Chairs and curtains aren't conscious subjects on panpsychism. The particles that make them up would be, but the object itself isn't a subject of experience. As far as I can tell, the main point modern panpsychists are trying to convey is that experience goes down much farther than we typically imagine. Sometimes panpsychists can sound like dualists, and this is a result of embracing what we know about mind and what we know about matter. The reason for the dualistic sounding language is that within panpsychism, there is a sort of dualism between the internal and the external. Panpsychism is monistic, there's only matter, and material processes are synonymous with consciousness. You can observe matter from the outside, externally, or you can be matter. It's like something to be matter, there's an interior, a subjective aspect to matter. That's the internal. The external is all the matter that's not you. The internal realm is matter viewed from the inside, from the perspective of matter, from your perspective. And from your perspective, I'm a part of the external. From my perspective, you're a part of the external. The internal-external distinction is sometimes mistaken as substance dualism by the critics of panpsychism. Panpsychists are full realists about conscious experience, and full realists about matter, which is what produces dualistic-sounding language on occasion. But panpsychists don't subscribe to the conventional assumptions about what matter is, or about the division between mind and body shared by pretty much everyone else. Panpsychism existed in the East and West for centuries, arguably millennia, but it's finding proponents today because it offers an attractive synthesis between physicalism and dualism, and as David Chalmers said, quote, captures the virtues of both and the vices of neither, end quote. Dualism suffers from the interaction problem, or the problem of causal closure, and leaves us with a radically disunified picture of nature. Panpsychism is compatible with physical causal closure. Consciousness fills in the structure that's already there. It doesn't add any additional structure, like dualism, so there's no interaction problem for panpsychism. On the other hand, materialism offers a unified vision of the world, unlike dualism, but it does so at the cost of eliminating some inconvenient aspects of reality that are difficult to explain. Many materialist philosophers have given up the reality of phenomenal experience because they mistakenly think it's required of them, required by naturalism, physicalism, or modern science. Materialism leaves us with the explanatory gap, or the hard problem of consciousness. Panpsychism solves the hard problem. It cuts it off at the root, so there is no explanatory gap. Panpsychism has the merits of dualism and materialism and the problems of neither. It embraces the reality of conscious experience while carefully respecting the basic pillars of naturalism and physicalism. Moreover, it fills in a huge gap in our current picture of the world, namely the intrinsic nature of the physical, a matter on which physics is entirely silent. Panpsychism does suffer from the combination problem. Panpsychists are being asked to explain the relationship between particle-level consciousness and systems-level consciousness, how little conscious things make a unified conscious thing. And there are a few questions that, if not dealt with at the outset, will cause everyone to talk past one another in a discussion on the combination problem. First, what is your view of the self? In other words, what are the parts combining into? The problem seems more or less tractable depending on your view of the self. If experiences simply arise in conscious awareness, including the experience of being a self, then perhaps there isn't as much to explain compared to a version of the self that includes some kind of unchanging core, or some entity that is the experiencer of experiences. Moreover, if the self, the entity being combined into, is more of a process and less of an object, as it would seem to me, then the activities of combining, blending, fusing, etc. seem less mysterious. Something in flux, rather than quiescent, would at least seem easier to combine. Processes combining with other processes to create bigger processes seems like less of a feat of radical emergence than two discrete, quiescent objects combining or fusing into another object. The second question is, what is your view of fundamental physics? In other words, what are the parts that are doing the combining? The combination problem seems to be frequently presented in language that paints a picture of billions of little objects, like atoms, coming together and somehow fusing. However, the world is not fundamentally little grainy bits. Rather, it's unfamiliar entities like wave functions and fields. My comments on the first question complement this view: flux versus quiescence, objects versus processes, since the wave function seems to be more of a process than an object. Excitations or fluctuations in quantum fields, as well, are different enough from atoms, tiny unsplittable objects, that it seems relevant in any discussion of the combination problem. So before we have any conversation about the combination problem, we have to figure out what is our view of the self, the thing being combined into, and what's our view of fundamental physics, the stuff doing the combining. I think that hidden assumptions in these two areas make the combination problem seem harder than it is. The philosopher Luke Roelofs has been studying mental combination from the other direction, in split brain patients. The severing of the corpus callosum means that information can't be directly shared between the two hemispheres of the brain, and as you may be aware, many strange and interesting results have been observed as a result of this disunity. One side of the brain or body can have information that the other side does not. One side can know something that the other side doesn't. Split brain patients present a sort of decombination problem. They also provide us with an opportunity to explore the empirical, objective side of the combination problem. To quote Philip Goff, the severing of the corpus callosum seems to lead to mental decombination. What was once a single, unified mind now becomes two separate conscious subjects. If that's right, then we may be able, by imagining the reverse of what led to decombination, to infer what is required for mental combination. In this way, split brain cases can potentially give us an empirical handle on mental combination. I agree with Annika Harris that the name Panpsychism is a bit of a liability. We could, with equal accuracy, call Panpsychism modified materialism or neo-materialism, though I don't think this will ultimately be necessary. I think the connotations of the name could be changed with enough time and exposure. Panpsychism, despite its new agey sounding name, is a product of physicalists and materialists attempting to refine physicalism such that it doesn't require us to deny anything we know from the sciences, but also doesn't require that we deny anything we know about consciousness from our own case. When one hears that materialist philosophers like Dan Dennett and Keith Frankish deny the thing we know with the most certainty, one must ask, why are they doing this? The answer is because they define themselves as materialists or physicalists. They think that if everything is physical, you can't believe there is phenomenal consciousness. I agree that everything is physical, but I don't think that rules out the reality of consciousness, because I don't see any reason to suppose that consciousness is non-physical. Although I think consciousness is the one thing that can't be an illusion, I can appreciate where those materialists are coming from. There appears to be a challenge here reconciling materialism or physicalism with consciousness. We're materialists. We think the whole world is made of physical stuff. And consciousness, intuitively, doesn't seem like physical stuff at all. It seems non-physical. An intuitive conception of consciousness would place it outside of the realm of the material, like Descartes. Well, if we're going to be rigorous physicalists, we can't allow non-physical things to really exist. A big mistake of materialists is that they think they know what the physical is, and they think they know it with such certainty that physicalism rules out the existence of phenomenal consciousness. And people like me are really anti-physicalists and anti-materialists, even though I think there's nothing but the physical, and that humans are composed solely of material. The funny thing is, they agree with Descartes in a way that I don't. As I mentioned, they think that physical stuff is so well understood that we know it couldn't involve consciousness, and that to admit the reality of consciousness would be to admit the reality of something non-physical. Descartes and Dan Dennett share that assumption. Panpsychists do not. So what about physics? Physics obviously tells us lots of true things about physical stuff. It teaches us about its structure, how it will behave under certain conditions, what it will do. But physics does not and cannot tell us the intrinsic nature of matter, insofar as it has an intrinsic nature, in addition to its structure. Many rational and scientifically oriented people believe that if we just do more neuroscience, everything will be answered in time. What I'm saying is that physical science is categorically unable to answer all of our questions about consciousness. Even if you disagree with me that science is unable in principle to explain consciousness, you have to at least admit that this is not a normal scientific question. You can't observe consciousness, except in your own case. No one else can directly perceive your experience. You can't directly perceive anyone else's. So sure, there's no way to test whether or not an atom is conscious, but it has to be one or the other. It's either like something to be or it's not. There's no way of looking inside it to see if it has experience, but there's no way of looking inside someone's brain to see if they have experience. Consciousness has this strange property of only being observable by the chunk of matter itself, by the subject of experience. Even when you know it's there, it's impossible to view it objectively, from a third-person point of view. And yet we know for certain that it's real.
Yeah, what I'm keen to press is the philosophical underpinnings of this problem. It's not just, another scientific problem. And there are a number of ways of getting at this, but for me, the core of the problem is that physical science works with a purely quantitative vocabulary, whereas consciousness is an essentially qualitative phenomenon, just in the simple sense that it involves qualities. If you think about the redness of a red experience or the smell of coffee or the taste of mint, you can't capture these kind of qualities in a purely quantitative vocabulary. And so, as long as your description of the brain is framed in the purely quantitative vocabulary of neuroscience, you're always going to leave out these kind of qualities and therefore leave out consciousness itself, really. So a key moment in the scientific revolution is Galileo's declaration that mathematics is to be the language of the new science. The new science is to have a purely quantitative vocabulary. But Galileo understood quite perfectly well that you can't capture consciousness in these terms. Consciousness is a qualitative phenomenon, and so you can't capture it in a purely quantitative language. So Galileo said, what we have to do is put consciousness outside of the domain of science. That's in the soul. Once we've done that, we can capture everything else in mathematics. So, this kicks off mathematical physics, people forget, the philosophical starting point, mathematical physics has gone incredibly well. But we need to remember that it was only ever intended as a partial description of reality. The whole project was premised on putting consciousness outside of the domain of science. As I say, many people have this idea, we'll just do a bit more neuroscience and we'll crack it. They say, there's a problem, but look at the great success of physical science in explaining more and more of our universe. Of course this should give us confidence that it'll one day crack the problem of consciousness. If Galileo were to time travel to the present day and hear about this problem of explaining consciousness with physical science, he'd say, of course you can't do that. I designed physical science to deal with the quantitative, not the qualitative.
Right.
I gave it's gone well because I gave it a really limited focus.
It also bears repeating that there is not as much evidence as one would think that non-conscious matter exists. We actually don't know that there is any non-experiential reality, and the reasons for supposing that there is such a thing as non-conscious matter are shockingly inadequate. The biggest clue we have of the intrinsic nature of matter is the fact that we too are part of the physical universe. We are made of matter. The one thing we know for certain of matter is that it's at least sometimes conscious. Positing non-experiential matter at the fundamental levels is theoretically more expensive and totally unjustified. We know that there is experiential matter, and we do not know that there is any non-experiential matter. If we suppose there is, we're stuck with radical emergence to try to magic the experiential out of the wholly non-experiential. Panpsychism is a better explanation of consciousness than materialism, idealism, or dualism. It answers the so-called mind-body problem in full. Panpsychism is a version of physicalism, one that takes seriously the fact that you are part of the physical universe and our direct knowledge of the intrinsic nature of matter. It's a naturalistic, monistic, parsimonious, theoretically elegant way of understanding consciousness and matter that explains the most while giving up the least. So I've linked in the show notes plenty of podcasts and YouTube videos for your listening enjoyment if you'd like to hear more about panpsychism and philosophy of mind. I would especially recommend anything from Galen Strawson. Thank you for listening. I've been Emerson Green, and I'll talk to you next time.